Let's get into some of the more interesting information that you can store inside of a variable. The game data operand allows you to store various pieces of data from your game into a variable. For this tip, we'll be talking about the item, weapon, and armor categories. In a conditional branch, you can check whether or not the party has one of these items, but you can't check how many. That's where variables come in. Let's say the party needs to have 4 dragon bangles as a proof they passed 4 different trials. Create a variable that will store how many dragon bangles the party has. Then make a condition that checks whether or not that variable equals 4. Now the party can save the world. Let's talk about finding inspiration to continue to work on your game. I often, and let me stress often, find myself getting completely obsessed working on my RPG Maker project for 2 or 3 days, and then my motivation to work on it just tanks. It's not that I don't have ideas or anything, I just get distracted by other games and get overwhelmed with the amount of things there are to do in my project. So if you're like me, here's something I do to help me get motivated again. If my game is inspired by a particular series, usually playing that game will get me out of my rut. For example, my current game is inspired by 2D Zelda in some aspects, so right now I'm playing through the GBC titles. Often the joy and nostalgia I get from playing these games will give me some energy to work on my own project and might even give me a few ideas. Simple and somewhat obvious, but effective. Let me know some of your favorite ways to get inspired in the comments. Here's another useful thing that you can store inside of variables. You can store the party's current gold amount in a variable. Why is this useful? This can come in handy in a situation where you have split parties with differing inventories, maybe groups of future party members that haven't met yet. This can also be useful for flashback scenes where you still allow the player to access the menu. It wouldn't make sense if you had just as much gold in a flashback as you do now. It would take away a bit of the immersion. To do this, when the flashback or party split occurs, simply store the gold in a variable and remove that amount of gold from the party. Then when the flashback is over or the party regroups, add that original gold amount back to the party. Some of the coolest moments in RPGs are when an NPC character decides to join the party and fight with you. Having guest party members like this can really make the world feel more alive, and that the people in it have their own intentions and personalities outside of the party that the player is constantly traveling with and making choices for. Luckily for us, this is very easy to do in RPG Maker. Create your NPC character, their stats, their skills, and even give them a custom class if you want to. Then all you have to do to make them act on their own is go to traits and add the special flag auto battle. This will make the character with this trait battle on their own. This special flag can also be used in other things like a specific class or piece of equipment. As an example, you could use it to make a berserker class that fights on their own. Wouldn't it be great if you could just steal all of a guest NPC's equipment and use it for your own party? That's exactly what the player is going to do if you don't add the lock equip trait for that guest NPC. When you use lock equip, it does exactly what it sounds like and does not allow the player to change or unequip anything of that type for that character. Go to your list of traits, add a new one, go to the equip tab and select lock equip. Then choose what type of equipment you want to lock. Now the NPC won't be involuntarily donating their gear to the main party. Okay, let's talk about fade out and fade in. These are pretty self-explanatory commands. Fade out fades the screen to black. Fade in brings it back in. There's just a few things to know. You always have to have a fade in after a fade out. If you fade out and do something like transition to another map or anything like that, it's just going to be a black screen. You always have to fade the screen back in. The fade out and fade in can be pretty quick. It seems like it's only like half a second, but you can change that if you add a wait command in between them. This would be good if you wanted to add like a dramatic effect to the scene, maybe give the player just a little bit longer to digest what just happened. The last thing to note here is that if you're going to do any kind of visual change, you should do it while the screen is faded out. If you do it when the screen fades back in, the player is going to see that. So if you're adding or removing party members, if you're changing party graphics, if you're changing map graphics, you want to do that while the screen is faded out so that that change has already happened when the screen is faded back in. All right, comments. Let's talk about why they're important. After taking a brief hiatus from this game, I came back to work on the custom battle system, and this is just a mess. There's a lot of variables being changed, switches being turned on, pictures being shown, and while I could go through here and just look at it step by step to relearn it, what would really help me to catch up where I left off would be comments. If you've done any sort of programming, you know how important comments are. Now that I've added comments, I can kind of see at a glance, step by step, what each section of the event flow does. It's much easier to understand this way. For me personally, this also kind of works out as like a planner. Sometime I'll just add steps in comments and then put the events in between the steps. If you have a lot of complex event flows or custom systems, I highly recommend using comments to keep your event flows organized. Here's another thing you can store inside of variables in RPG Maker MZ. You can store the actor ID of a particular member that's in your party. You can use this for a variety of things, but two of them in particular come to mind. You can use this to create an NPC that only wants to speak to a particular character in the party and have the player put that character in the leader position before the NPC will start a quest, for instance. You could also use this to remember which order the party was in before switching to a flashback or alternate party. That way you can put it back together in the exact order the player had them. I'll be doing a creative mechanic on this in the future.